Okay, everyone, welcome to A Wind Win, How Raptors and Wind Turbines Can Coexist. I am joined today by Dr. Meg Murgatroyd, who will be exploring the conservation conflict between wind energy and raptors. She's also going to discuss the model she's created to help South African wind farms pick less hazardous locations for Varese Eagles. Before we get started, I just want to say a really big thank you to the Salt Lake County ZAP program for their funding of free presentations like this one, and also the generosity of so many of our supporters who are on this call. We truly could not do this without you. So thanks again to all of our supporters. Meg, will you take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks everybody for tuning in. So I'm Meg, and I'm based here in South Africa as one of Hawkwatch International's conservation biologists. And this work is looking at the impacts of wind energy on raptors in South Africa, and it's work that has been going on for the past couple of years now. So to get started, wind energy poses a bit of an environmentalist green-green dilemma. Obviously, in comparison to fossil fuel-based alternatives, wind energy can offer a solution which vastly reduces carbon emissions, which are contributing to global warming and biodiversity loss in the first place. But it's not without its negative environmental impacts. And it's been known since around the 1980s that birds are killed by wind turbines, and there are varying requirements around the world on how we deal with this. In South Africa, the wind industry is relatively new. Our first wind farm became operational in 2014. But pre-construction monitoring at the operational sites that we have has now shown that raptors are threatened by turbines here too. And as the industry grows here, we really need to start taking proactive steps to solve this problem before it gets any bigger. So this is some of the results from Carcass Surveys from below operational turbines in South Africa. So these are people that go out and they're surveying and picking up and recording what birds have been found dead. And from this, we can see that of all bird groups, raptors are disproportionately impacted, making up around 36% of the collisions that occur. People often compare the numbers of birds killed, say, by cats versus the number of birds killed by wind turbines to make the conclusion that we shouldn't really worry about wind turbines, and cats are actually a much bigger killer. And although I don't want to underplay the impacts of cats, in this case, it's a poor argument because it's really about the types of birds which are killed by turbines, which are a big concern. And we are really worried about the loss of our top predators, and in some cases, our scavengers like the vultures. And why are we so worried about them? Well, we're talking about population level impacts because raptors generally have smaller and more endangered populations, and they're long-lived and have a late maturity, sometimes taking 5 years or more to reach adulthood and breed. And they often have a slow reproductive rate too, producing only 1 chick per year. So although direct mortality is what we often think about, there's also other impacts like habitat loss, disturbance, and these can lead to breeding failure as well. So all of this can impact the loss of one individual. A few individuals can start having impacts which are seen much bigger at population levels, and that's what we're really worried about with these birds. And to highlight the birds which are most at risk to negative population level impacts, in South Africa, BirdLife South Africa actually created this sensitivity ranking, and that takes into account the species status, its distribution and behavior, its size, and therefore the susceptibility to collisions too. And in this list, we'll look at the top 6 now. This list is created for all birds, but actually the top 6 are raptors. So we've got the Cape vulture as the most sensitive species in the country, then the bearded vulture, the Varese eagle, the Marshall eagle, the wattled crane, and then the black harrier. So this again just emphasizes emphasizes how much more at risk and raptors are compared to other bird species. And of those raptors in that list, 3 of them have already got BirdLife South Africa species guidelines, and they inform the way impacts assessment should be done concerning wind power. And these guidelines all aim to avoid development in areas of high use. This is commonly done by restricting activity or development in circular buffers around nests. So for Varese eagles, the recommended buffer size is about a 3-kilometer radius around the nest. However, this was derived from a very short period of tracking. It's about 3 weeks for 5 individuals. It's not really good enough, but we'll talk more about this a little bit later. And we're currently trying to revise this minimum to a minimum of 3.7 kilometers, and in some cases up to 5.2 kilometers, depending on the site. And these are areas that should be treated as sensitive, and development should either be excluded or at least mitigated in some ways. For Cape vultures, they have very large home ranges, at least though they do come together in roosts and colonies where you can protect multiple individuals. But for those sites, no development should occur within 18 kilometers of a roost or a colony. And in some cases, up to 50 kilometers is treated as sensitive. And then lastly, for black harriers, sometimes single birds roost in the same location, and those roost locations are recommended to be buffered by 1 to 3 kilometers. And roosts where there's more than one bird or nest sites, those should be buffered by 3 to 5 kilometers. So, I mean, this is a really great starting point for recommendations, but birds don't stick to these circular patterns, so they don't necessarily always work for raptors, and they don't necessarily always work for developers either, because developers, obviously, they want to make the most of the land, and in some cases, these buffers might be excluding areas which are actually safe for wind development to go ahead. So a lot of the work that we've been doing here is trying to find better alternatives that work better for both parties than just basic circular buffers. So to start with the Varese Eagle, this bird, similar to those of you who know the golden eagle, they're a very, very similar species. They're monogamous and long-lived. Unlike the golden eagle, though, they only raise 1 chick per year. A golden eagle can raise 2, or in some cases, even 3 chicks. They're territorial, and they actually stay on that territory all year. So these birds are not migrating. They're around their nest and in their territory throughout the season. They breed on cliffs and occasionally in trees, and actually also on power lines sometimes. These high voltage lattice pylons, they'll breed on them. And they've been found to be present at 60% of proposed wind development. So there is a large conflict between wind energy and this particular species. And we've seen that now with more than 20 more than 20 collisions of this species have been recorded, both adults and juveniles. So to understand their flight behavior and the causes of these collisions, I started to deploy GPS tags on adult eagles in 2011 while I was doing my PhD at the University of Cape Town. And this work was then continued in 2016 and 17 as a postdoc in the Fitzpatrick Institute there. And basically, we were using these little 44-gram tags, and they're solar powered, and they can take a location up to every 3 seconds. Though generally, we were collecting a location around every 2 minutes. These are the sample sizes of birds that I caught. So basically, in total, we tagged 8 female eagles and 8 male eagles. And we got nearly 60,000 in-flight locations. So this is after removing all of the data where birds were perched, which is actually quite a significant amount of time. It's nearly 14 bird years of data, and this came from 4 different study areas. So between these study areas, I tried to cover different habitats in terms of topography and different densities of eagles, how close their neighbors were and things like that. So hopefully we can understand collision risk right across the full range of inhabited areas and make predictions right across South Africa on how these birds will be flying. So this is a little bit of the data from one of our eagles in the Karoo. And well, firstly, eagle flight's not randomly distributed. It's actually primarily driven by uplift availability, which is determined by topography. So when air is pushed up over a slope, you get orographic lift. And that's great for when eagles are soaring along ridge lines, and then in flat areas where the ground warms, air pockets, which then rise upwards, you get thermal lift. And then you see eagles circling and thermaling high in these thermals, and usually well out of reach of a turbine. So if you can predict lift based on the topography like that, then you can also predict eagle flight based on the topography. And the other important thing about eagles is they're territorial, and they spend more time close to their nest and further away from their neighboring nests. So we can use data like this to look at if eagles were flying at turbine risk height and what variables are associated with that risky flight. And to do this, each at-risk GPS fix was associated with the spatial information from a digital elevation model, as well as information on the distance to nests, both their own nest and proximity to neighboring nests. And when combined, we can use these variables to understand the probability of an eagle using a location and the likelihood of the eagle flying within the rotor swept area of the turbine, i.e. the collision risk potential, as we call it. So using this model, we can then predict if a turbine was placed anywhere in the environment, what's the likelihood that an eagle will fly in that collision risk zone? And more importantly, we can now use this model at proposed wind farm developments to understand risk right across the development before turbines are built. So here is an example of that. And in green, we've got the topography of an area, and the solid line is the boundary of the area the developers are interested in. And the dotted line is just a bit of a buffer around that where surveys would occur. The triangles are locations of eagle nests, and I've put a 3-kilometer circle around those inner nests because this is the current recommendation for where wind turbines shouldn't be built. But we do already know from the collisions that have occurred that that's not really working. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But the red crosses are proposed turbine locations, and in this proposal, they are outside of the 3-kilometer buffers. And if we run the collision risk model using the nest locations and the topography of this site, we get an output, which is the probability of a collision. And this is nice, but it's still not very meaningful for a developer. We really need a cutoff point, which we've defined within the model to be able to say the areas where turbines should and shouldn't be placed. So then we return a map that looks more like this to the developer, where the dark blue areas are high risk, and we recommend no turbine should be built. The lighter blue areas are medium risk, and we recommend mitigation, like maybe a shutdown and demand system or something should be implemented on any turbines in those locations. And the yellow and the white is low risk, and we recommend that it's a good place for a development to go ahead as far as the eagles go. It poses the least risk. So from this output, we can see that there are 6 turbines which are potentially risky to eagles, and we can highlight that really early on in the development process, and developers can then make a plan to either move or remove those turbines and have them sited in safer locations. And we've actually had a great response to this model. It's been applied to more than 20 developments in South Africa over the past 12 months. And then I suppose the cool thing about it is it kind of provides a win-win, providing better protection for eagles, but also saving space for wind energy developments. They would be requiring huge buffers if we were just to protect the proper home range of an eagle. And it also saves them some time and some money in terms of getting a risk prediction really early on in the planning stages. So one last thing to share on that model is basically, so I tested the model on eagles with trackers, but we also tested it on the collisions which have occurred. So in this plot, there were 14 adult collisions, and I ran the model using all the nests in proximity to the wind farms where those collisions occurred to see if they would have been predicted by the model, and then also to see how big a buffer would have needed to be to capture those collisions as well. And this is the red line there now is the first model threshold. So that's if we were to exclude turbines from the high and the medium risk zones we just looked at, we would have actually prevented 80% of those collisions. And if we were going to prevent 80% of those collisions with a circular buffer, that would need to be nearly 7 kilometers big radius. If we only protected the high risk areas, we would still at least have avoided 50% of those collisions. And for a buffer achieving the same sort of thing, the buffers would need to be just over 5 kilometers. So obviously, we would rather developers were going to use the model, but in the absence of that, we're updating the current guidelines to say that at least no development should occur within 3.7 kilometers of an eagle's nest, and that would at least avoid at least 40% of the collisions, and there should be some mitigation or extra monitoring within 5.2 kilometers from an eagle's nest. And just to show you in comparison, that's the current recommendation. The 3 kilometer buffer captured only 30% of the collisions that have occurred. So we can really see that it's not sufficient and it's not working. So I'm happy the model is available and is being used, and so it represents quite a big advance on the old recommendations. And now going forward, we basically want to introduce similar things for other species. So the next most important species to me is the black harrier. It's Southern Africa's rarest endemic raptor. On the IUCN Red List, it's classified as endangered, and there's actually only less than 1,000 adults left. These birds breed on the ground. They usually lay between 3 and 5 eggs, and they have quite an unusual intra-African migratory pattern, which is shown here from some previous work. And basically, they have these sort of east-west movements. Outside of the breeding season, they move eastwards, and inside of the breeding season, they come back to the west coast. So this is the habitat suitability for the birds right through the year. So they're occurring in all of the red and yellow kind of areas. And this is the habitat suitability just in the breeding season. So you can see their range basically contracts right back down to these coastal regions where they're breeding in very specific habitats. And this is a population viability assessment, which shows the likely trajectory if, firstly, if 3 additional adult mortalities occur per year, and then if 5 additional adult mortalities occur per year. So if we had these mortalities occurring frequently from wind turbine collisions, then the population trajectory is that it would be extinct within 75 years if we lose 5 extra adults per year. And unfortunately, there has been at least 9 fatalities across 5 wind farms just between 2014 and 2019. So that's around 2 birds per year. And that's just raw data. That's not collected. That's not corrected for any survey effort or for any scavenger removal of birds from sites. So the real number is probably higher than that already. And on top of that, the wind energy industry is growing rapidly. So unfortunately, I think it's fair to say these birds are in quite big trouble. So yeah, hopefully we can do something about that with some GPS tracking. And if we go back to the breeding, this is the breeding habitat suitability map again, and it's zoomed into Cape Town on that peninsula sticking out there on the southwest and the west coast. And we can see here, if we compare this map with the distribution of applications, so all of these polygons or these colored areas are applications for renewable energy developments, and the majority of them are wind farms. So there's a huge overlap between these developments, these proposed developments, and their distribution for breeding. So I'm quite interested in this area up here in the circle where it's really good breeding habitats, and there's a large number of developments planned. Some of them they'll be starting to construct probably within the next year or so. This area here where we've got really good breeding habitat in the dark blue there is actually a protected area. So we won't be seeing any wind farms directly in that dark blue, but there are wind farms lined up outside on the border of it. And then this area down here also looks like some really good breeding habitat. And again, there are wind developments planned nearby. So this is going to be one of the first places which I'm going to focus some of our tracking work. And yeah, these are the tags which we've just bought so that we can learn more about their flight and the variables that are associated with flying at risk height, and determine appropriate mitigation. It might be different from the Varese Eagles, but we hope that we'll be able to make recommendations that will reduce this conflict. And this is starting next month. In fact, next week, I'm going to start looking for their nests so we can start getting these tags out. And the tags are currently sitting in the US. So as soon as they arrive, we'll start tracking black harriers to mitigate this problem. And then the last species that we're going to talk about is the Cape vulture. Another endangered species, this one with less than 9,400 adults left, and their populations are also decreasing. They breed in colonies on cliffs, and they have a southern African distribution. So this map shows in the pink and the red areas are extinct areas of its former range. The blue is a non-breeding range where they occur in a lower density, and then the green is really the core breeding range. And in this green area, we've already had more than 20 collisions of this species as well, and that's just between 2017 and 2020. But unlike the eagles and the harriers, multiple organizations have been working on Cape vultures already, and they've accrued a huge amount of tracking data. So 6 of these organizations listed there have tagged 70 individuals, and that spanned 15 years of tracking from 2005 to 2019, and got around 1.5 million GPS locations. And then some of the other organizations, they've been collecting information on colonies, where their colonies occur and how many birds occur in each colony, and where people have got supplementary feeding sites, because obviously both of those things determine vulture movements, and they're more likely to be closer to a colony and closer to a supplementary feeding site. And like the eagles, topography also impacts where they're flying. So with the Fitzpatrick Institute and led by our postdoc, Francisco Cervantes, he's been analyzing the data with us, and this is actually a map which has just been, it's a bit of a preview of a map which is about to be released. And it looks at the distance to the colony and the distance to roosts and supplementary feeding sites, as well as the slope and the elevation, and gives a prediction for the likelihood of collision. So we plan to release this map soon, along with a couple of similar ones which break down the risk to adult individuals versus the risk to juveniles. And this will be freely available to the wind industry to inform site selection and pre-construction monitoring very early on. And so we hope that in this way, having an early impact on the sites, we can start avoiding having large turbines constructed right in the core range of this species. And to finish, this is the trajectory of wind power development in South Africa. So down at the bottom end here, we've got our first wind farm, which was operational in 2014. And by the end of 2020, we had 32 operational wind farms. And right now, another 33 are being built. And those will contribute to a 2030 target of more than 11 gigawatts of installed energy capacity. So to put that into perspective for the potential impacts on raptors, these are just some examples from some of the species we've talked about. And in 2015 and 2016, there were 2 black harrier fatalities in each of those years. 2017, we lost 7 Cape vultures. And in 2019, it was 9 Varese Eagle fatalities. So we hope that our work will help to conserve raptors, but also assist the development of wind energy in South Africa in a sustainable and biodiversity-friendly way. So with that, thanks to everyone for listening and to all the organizations that have been involved in the work. And I guess over to Kirsten to field some questions if you have them.
Thank you so much for providing that presentation today, Meg. It was really interesting to hear all the progress that you've made for Verreaux Eagles and to start hearing about the next steps with the project. So it is time for the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions for Meg about wind turbines, about Verreaux Eagles, black harriers, what it's like to do this type of work, happy to field any of those. You can use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. But while we're waiting on a few questions to come in, because I know folks were listening really intently, Meg, could you talk about the transmitters and the opportunity that we hope to have later this year for folks?
Yeah, sure. So as we start to tag these birds, and it's black harriers, and there's a couple of other species, in fact, that I didn't even cover today. We're also starting a project on tawny eagles, and we're working on martial eagles as well. So I'm going to be busy over the next few months trying to get more transmitters out on all of those species. And if anybody would like to sponsor one of those individuals, Kirsten's going to be setting up a bit of a waiting list. So as I catch a bird and put a transmitter on, you have the opportunity to sponsor that bird. And I don't know if that list live yet, or do they just email you to get on the waiting list?
So I just put the link in the chat. So if you're interested, it just requires your name and your email address, and you can let us know what species you're interested in as well. And so just to give like an idea of what that looks like. So if you choose to sponsor a bird, you will get a photo of the bird. You will get a little adoption certificate saying that you helped make this project possible. And then you'll also get to name the bird. And you'll receive regular updates from Meg about the movement of the species. So it's pretty neat. We had lots of people who sponsored vultures as we started our telemetry work over in Africa, and they've all really enjoyed it. So if you're interested, definitely take a look at that sign-up list that's in the chat. And also, just as a heads up, we're actually going to be moving to a monthly sponsorship option. That way it makes it a little bit more possible for everybody to be part of this really interesting work. So that is in the chat. Have a question that's come in. So how might collision risk vary between species across topography?
Cool. So that's it. But between species, you said, not within. So like for different species.
Yeah, between species.
Okay, cool. Good question. So I'm going to compare Varese eagles and black harriers because they're quite different species. And basically, for a Varese eagle, they are primarily soaring along ridges. So we're really worried about particularly turbines which are going up along those kind of features where they're likely to be sort of soaring on that orographic lift quite often. because of their morphology, the way they've got these like huge wings which just catch that lift so nicely. So it does make it quite predictable, their flight along those kind of features, versus a black harrier, which is actually a much smaller bird. And what researchers think at the moment, black harriers actually spend a lot of time flying low and a lot of time flying under the turbine blades. So they were initially thought probably that they wouldn't be a big collision risk with black harriers, but it turns out obviously that there is a problem. And whether it's time of year or time of day or age or how far they're along with the breeding, we're not really sure. But one of the ideas is that they do these like quite magnificent display flights, and they'll fly up and drop prey or pass it to their partner, and it could be during those times that they're actually flying much higher and hitting the turbines. So yeah, their flight's actually very different, and so their collision risk very different from a Varese Eagle. And I guess that's what we've got to try and identify, with the tracking.
Yeah, another question that came in as we were, advertising this event, Meg, was just about different options for wind energy. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that in terms of Raptors. Like, I know somebody brought up bladeless turbines and things like that. Do you have thoughts on those in terms of, the potential for wind farms and also the potential for, having less impact on raptor populations?
Yeah, I don't know. I must say I don't know a great deal about like different designs. I've seen ones which are more like sort of a rotating structure around a central pole and things like that. And I mean, they look better for raptors, but whether or not they really produce the same amount of energy and for the same cost, and if they're realistic alternatives, I don't know. But there are potentially other things that manufacturers can do before the turbines are even installed. So one of the main things that has been brought up lately is the idea that if we paint one of the blades, if you paint one of the blades a different color, it creates a motion smear, and then as it spins, the whole structure is a lot more visible. And some researchers in Norway have done a test on that, and they did find a reduction of collisions. Their sample size was quite small, and obviously the species that they're dealing with are different. So we don't know if it's a universal solution yet. And we are actually currently in discussions with a wind farm here in South Africa that has had a large number of Varese Eagle collisions. And we're hoping that we'll set up a blade painting experiment. So we're actually going to go in and paint half their turbines and then track the eagles that are on site and see if they start avoiding those painted turbines a little bit more. That's quite an exciting project because it could be quite a low cost solution if it does work. But we don't know yet whether that design is going to be good enough or not. We'll see.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Meg, because that was another alternative that was brought up in some of the early conversations around this event. So I'm really glad you were able to speak to that, even though it's not the same species. Another question here, less related to the birds and more related to the politics of this, is what level of support or resistance have you experienced from wind development companies to the buffer area recommendations you're making?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously it's been mixed. Luckily, like our work is really strongly supported by BirdLife South Africa, and their production of those guidelines is the guidelines that they produce are known as best practice, and that's what EIA consultants are then meant to follow. So as long as we can produce it in the guidelines, although the guidelines are also reviewed by the wind energy industry. So we do need to come to some kind of agreement on what these buffers should be. And as you can imagine, they are not, they would rather have a 3-kilometer buffer and we stop doing all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, those 3-kilometer buffers are not working. So at least they are receptive and they are understanding, and they've acknowledged that there's an issue and they're happy to work with us. They would like to keep the recommendations as minimum as possible to increase their development revenue, I suppose. So it is a bit mixed. But what the main trend that I've seen is that it's the wind developers that have already got developments which are in process that might already even have environmental authorization, and they're based on the 3 kilometer buffer zones. They're not very willing to change their design now because they've already spent a lot of money on their development, and it's been budgeted on the idea of the layout of the turbines that they've got. So it's almost like a little bit too late for the ones that are already that far through planning. But the new developments that are just going in now, and developers who are just having a fresh look at a new area and they want to put up the first turbines, those guys are keen. Like they'll come straight for a little that we call the model Verreaux. It stands for Varese Eagle risk assessment. So they'll come for a Verreaux assessment very early on, and it seems like if we can catch the developers early enough, basically before they've started planning their turbines layout, then we do have good buy-in.
Well, that's great to hear, Meg, and it seems to, really raise the reason for doing this work right now as wind energy is really starting to take off in Africa. Another question. So this is about the amount of space available for wind development. So when you are using the collision risk model, is the amount of space available for development the same as it was? Is it less? Is it more? Can you speak to the amount of space available for the developers?
In terms of once the model has been run versus a buffer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, in fact, so it depends what the aim is. So if you compare it to a 3 kilometer buffer, obviously there's less space available. It's going to try and protect more than just a 3 kilometer buffer. But if you compare it to a buffer size big enough to give the same level of protection as the model does, then actually the recommendations will take less space away from the development. So yeah, if you're aiming to say protect 80% of an eagle's home range with either a buffer or the model will use less space than a buffer will.
Great. So this is getting a bit more into the technical components of some of the things you do, Meg. And so maybe as you're answering this question, you can provide a little bit of background for those of us who are not wind energy raptor experts. So this is a two-part question. So I'll ask the first and let you answer and then come back to the second part. So what about the wake effect of flights below and in the vicinity of wave sweep?
Ooh. So in terms of what? Like what does it affect or the effect?
So
I'm not sure if I completely understood the.
If the person who asked that wants to provide a bit more clarity, I'm happy to refill that to Meg. The second part of that question was, how do you determine the buffer zones where there are multiple raptors in the area?
Yeah, so it does get a bit when there's there can be multiple Varese Eagles, obviously, like in the example of the wind development that I showed. And that's, yeah, then you get all these different exclusions. But then when you get multiple raptors, you do get these sort of like, you start to overlay maps. And in fact, the wind developer, they look at each component and they probably sigh every time the next specialist comes along, because you've got your Varese Eagle specialist. He says you need to buffer this area and everything, and then you have a Marshall Eagle on site and they'll probably say, oh, you need to put a 5 kilometer buffer around that nest. But then you've also got your archaeological specialist who says, no, there's some really like ancient remains over there and you can't put any development in that area either. And then your bat specialists as well. So it does, like, you layer on all of these effects, and then the visual impact that you don't want, like, yeah, you're not allowed to be able to see a wind turbine from a national park and things like that. So they do end up sort of overlaying all these buffers, and this like ginormous area that they start with saying, well, we're going to put a development in this area, slowly gets like chipped away at until they have like a relatively small area to develop. But I mean, that's what the EIA process is all about. Like South Africa is a big country and we've got big wide open spaces. So if EIAs are done properly, that's exactly what we should be doing, like chipping away and just finding those small pockets where we can get some sustainable development.
That's great. So I have some clarity on that first question. So does the wake effect cause turbulence?
The wake from the turbine itself. Yeah, I think it does. It does in some extent. I mean, I'm not completely familiar with that, but I've heard that when the turbine spins, obviously there's like almost a vortex around the turbine, which is almost like a suction. So that's one thing, that when an eagle's like so close to it, it can almost be maybe sucked towards it in some ways. And then I have also heard, I'm not the expert on this, so I'm prepared to be corrected, but there's some kind of effect of air movement that when the turbines are spinning, that it creates some turbulence above the turbines, which almost creates lift above the turbines, and then birds actually are attracted to that because it creates some kind of turbulence and uplift that they can utilize, which is a bit unfortunate because that increases the conflict. But I don't know the details of that, but I have, I'm aware that there is some kind of effect there. Yeah.
Great. Well, we have a little bit more time, and I know we still have quite a few people on with us. So if you have any other questions, we're happy to keep taking them. I know Meg is, happy to answer as much as she can. But we did have one clarifying question on sponsoring a transmitter and what that means. So just to recap, if you are interested in sponsoring a transmitter, it's a pretty unique opportunity. So you get to name the bird, you receive a photo of the species, and then you also get a little adoption certificate, and then you get some regular reports from Meg and the team. I believe we've gone to quarterly now on those, about their movements. Meg, could you speak to what that looks like a little bit more, in terms of what that report looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I make these reports for our birds, and basically I make it in an HTML file format, but that basically means that it's a little bit interactive in that each quarter you get a little rundown of where your bird's been, maybe like some summary statistics about it, how far it's traveled or how many GPS locations it's collected, and that kind of thing. And then there'll be a little map that you can zoom into and sort of click on the locations and just kind of check out where it's been.
Perfect. Well, again, if you're interested in sponsoring a transmitter, you can sign up for updates on our website. I put the link in the chat, but for anyone who's not looking at their screen right now, it's just hawkwatch.org/transmitter-waitlist. And we'll send out an email there when we get those transmitters available for sponsorship. And if you sign up on that list, you'll be the first to hear about them, because some species do go fairly quickly. I know folks have birds that they feel a closeness to and they really want to have. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat right now. So thank you again, Meg, for being willing to talk about this dilemma between wind energy, which we definitely need, and the raptors that are soaring past them. If you have any other questions, y'all, I'm sure Meg would be happy to take them at her email address that's listed there, or you're always welcome to email us at hwi@hawkwatch.org. Thanks again for joining, everybody.
Thanks.